Think of a massive, long-running theatrical production, like a multi-million-dollar Broadway show.
Okay, yeah. The really big spectacles.
Right. So you sit in the audience, you see the elaborate sets, the flawless lighting, all those seamless transitions, and you just kind of assume the theater owns all of it.
Yeah, you assume the people pulling the ropes and running the spotlights are permanent fixtures of the building itself.
Exactly. But if you look backstage, you realize the theater really only owns the empty stage. I mean, the actors, the stagehands, the lighting technicians, they're all freelancers.
Right.
They were hired for a specific run through a third-party agency, and when the show is over, they pack up their gear and leave. The theater itself retains none of their knowledge.
It completely reframes how you look at the production, doesn't it?
It really does.
You're looking at this beautiful, highly functional illusion that's built entirely on temporary, outsourced talent.
And that is exactly what we're talking about today. If you're listening to this deep dive and wondering why your state's digital DMV portal just crashed, or, how a government unemployment website handles 1 million sudden claims, you have to look at the hidden architecture underneath those systems.
Which is largely invisible to the public.
Completely invisible. So today, we're looking at the digital infrastructure of an entire state government. We're examining a stack of procurement documents from the Florida Department of Management Services.
Specifically, an invitation to bid for information technology staff augmentation.
Right, which sounds incredibly dry. But our mission today is to translate this highly bureaucratic, dense contracting document into a fascinating masterclass on how a government actually buys its tech talent.
Yeah, we're going to look right past all that legal jargon.
Exactly. We want to understand the sheer scale of government contracting, the incredibly strict rules of engagement, and what it actually takes for a business to grab a slice of a massive financial pie.
And we should probably set the stakes right up front, because there is a staggering number dropped right in the middle of the source text.
Yes, let's talk about that number. In fiscal year 2025 to 2026 alone, this specific IT staff augmentation contract had a total annual spend of over $430 million.
Which is just a breathtaking figure.
It's massive.
It really is. But the money is just a metric for the scale of their reliance. That $430 million represents the hidden machinery of how modern government actually functions.
Right, it's the backstage crew.
Exactly. It represents a massive army of temporary coders, network engineers, database architects, and cybersecurity analysts who are basically keeping the state's digital lights on. The state is operating the theater, but that $430 million is paying for the freelance crew.
So to understand how a vendor actually gets a piece of that $430 million, we have to look at the peculiar timeline of this specific document.
Yeah, the timeline is really interesting here.
Okay, let's unpack this. The state's current term contract for IT staff augmentation doesn't actually expire until September 30, 2027. Yet, this bid document is from August 2026.
Right.
The state is aggressively taking bids more than a year before the current roster of vendors is even scheduled to expire.
And this is where the mechanics of government procurement really clash with the reality of the tech industry.
How so?
Well, the state established a giant roster of approved vendors back in 2023. They signed these multi-year contracts. But technology does not operate on a multi-year government cycle.
Oh, definitely not.
Think about how much the landscape of artificial intelligence, cloud architecture, and cybersecurity has changed just since 2023.
It's basically a different world now.
Exactly. If the state waits until late 2027 to update its vendor roster, it is essentially locking itself out of hiring specialists in brand new technologies, simply because those job titles literally didn't exist when the original contract was written.
So they created a loophole, or, well, rather a formalized update mechanism. The document calls this a supplemental invitation to bid. It's exactly like a mid-season draft or, a trade deadline in sports.
That is a perfect way to look at it.
You can't renegotiate your current players' active contracts, but you are allowed to draft entirely new positions if you have gaps on the field.
Right. What's fascinating here is that the supplemental bid allows the state to accomplish two things at once. First, it allows entirely new vendors, maybe a startup that specializes in a very new type of machine learning, to get pre-qualified and join the state's contract.
Okay, makes sense.
And second, it allows the current vendors, the ones who have been on the roster since 2023, to bid on new job titles or new scope variants.
And scope variants are basically just specific gradations of experience within a tech role, right?
Exactly, like moving from a junior to a senior developer.
But the document places a massive restriction on those existing vendors. The text explicitly states that current vendors cannot use this supplemental bid to change their prices on the job titles they've already won.
Not a single cent.
They are completely locked in to their 2023 rates. So if you are a vendor and you agreed to supply a mid-level data analyst for, say, $80 an hour back in 2023, you can't come to this 2026 supplemental bid and say, hey, inflation has been tough. The market rate for this analyst is now $100. I need a raise.
The state refuses to budge on that. They use what are called ceiling rates, which is the absolute maximum hourly rate a vendor is legally allowed to charge.
Okay.
By locking existing vendors out of renegotiating their active ceiling rates, the state aggressively protects its long-term budget. They guarantee price stability for the duration of the original contract.
Right.
But simultaneously, by opening up this supplemental bid for new job titles, the state maintains the flexibility to adapt to emerging tech needs. They get the budgetary safety of a fixed contract with the operational agility of the open market.
It's honestly a brilliant bit of bureaucratic engineering. You enforce budget caps on the old technology, but you keep a door open to buy the new technology. So, if the state is holding this mid-season draft to bring in fresh blood, we have to look at who is actually allowed to walk through that door.
Right, because it's not a free-for-all.
Not at all. The source documents contain incredibly detailed pre-qualification requirements. A vendor can't just show up and offer to provide IT staff. They have to run an absolute gauntlet of certifications.
And this is where we see the state balancing its desire for a broad vendor pool against its need for absolute security and ethical compliance. The contrast between the financial requirements and the legal requirements is, well, it's stark.
Stark is an understatement. Looking at the baseline business requirements, I honestly thought there was a typo in the text when I first read it.
It's surprisingly low, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
To pre-qualify for this ecosystem, remember, a contract environment with over $430 million in annual spend a vendor only needs to prove they've generated at least $75,000 annually providing IT staff augmentation services in 3 of the last 10 years, along with 3 years of general IT contract experience. Wait, this is a contract with over $430 million in spend, but the minimum revenue to pre-qualify is only $75,000 a year. That feels like requiring a kid's lemonade stand ledger to apply for a corporate CFO job.
I know, on the surface, the disparity is massive. A vendor barely making a living wage could technically pre-qualify. But if we connect this to the bigger picture of state procurement, this incredibly low threshold is highly intentional.
Okay, why?
The state is not looking exclusively for massive multinational tech conglomerates. The documents explicitly reference the Office of Supplier Development.
Ah, I see.
The state of Florida has a mandate to support its local business community by creating accessible opportunities for smaller enterprises. They actively want supplier development.
So they want to bring the little guys in.
Exactly. They want small businesses, startups, and minority-owned firms to be able to enter this ecosystem and grow. If they set the revenue requirement at $5 or $10 million, they would immediately create an oligopoly of entrenched corporate giants.
So the state is intentionally taking a risk on smaller, unproven companies to stimulate the local business ecosystem. They're keeping the financial barrier to entry incredibly low.
Yes, the financial barrier is just a small speed bump. But the compliance barrier, the ethical and geopolitical barrier, that is an impenetrable brick wall.
Let's talk about that wall. Because to even submit a bid, vendors must sign a series of certifications confirming they are absent from several very specific state lists. I call them the naughty lists.
That's a good name for them. And the state takes these lists incredibly seriously.
Yeah.
A vendor must legally certify they are not on the suspended vendor list or the convicted vendor list, which tracks public entity crimes. They cannot be on the discriminatory vendor list, the antitrust violator vendor list, or the state's forced labor vendor list.
But the restrictions don't stop at the state line or even the national border. The geopolitical boundaries placed on these tech vendors are intensely strict.
This is where we see government purchasing power operating as an extension of foreign policy and state law. The documents mandate that vendors cannot have business operations in Cuba or Syria. They must certify they are not on the scrutinized companies' lists regarding Sudan or the Iran petroleum energy sector.
Wow.
Furthermore, they cannot be on lists of entities that boycott Israel, nor can they currently be engaged in a boycott of Israel.
Which makes you wonder, why does a state government care about international boycotts or Syrian operations when they are literally just trying to hire a database architect in Tallahassee?
Because public tax dollars cannot legally flow to entities that contradict the state's geopolitical stances or its established ethical laws.
That makes sense.
When a state spends $430 million, it isn't just buying a service, it is making a massive economic footprint. The government has to ensure that its financial footprint doesn't inadvertently subsidize foreign adversaries, forced labor, or geopolitical instability.
Right. It effectively turns a simple IT staffing contract into an enforcement mechanism for broader state policy.
Yeah.
And the text goes even further on the policy front. It explicitly states that the department puts vendors on notice regarding prohibitions against considering social, political, or ideological interests in government contracting. They cite Florida Statute 287.05701 for this.
Right.
So, just neutrally reporting what's in the text here. As a vendor, you are signing a legal attestation that external ideological factors will play no role in your business dealings with the state.
Correct. And it is not a one-time signature either.
Really?
No, the document explicitly states the vendor has an ongoing duty to notify the procurement officer if any of these circumstances change.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, if a vendor suddenly ends up on the antitrust list or begins operations in a prohibited country, they must report themselves.
So the state uses the low financial threshold to welcome a diverse pool of businesses, but it uses these strip-forbidden lists to totally insulate itself from liability, bad actors, and geopolitical risks.
Besides,
Okay, let's imagine a vendor successfully navigates all of this. A small, squeaky clean tech staffing firm passes the gauntlet. They meet the $75,000 threshold. They sign all the geopolitical certifications. Their ceiling rates for a dozen job titles are approved, and they are officially added to the state term contract.
they probably feel like they just won the lottery.
Oh, I'm sure they do, but they haven't won anything yet, have they?
No, getting pre-qualified and being placed on this contract guarantees a vendor absolutely zero work.
Zero. Being on the roster just means you are legally allowed to compete in the actual games.
Exactly.
To understand how a vendor actually places a worker and generates revenue, we have to examine the scope of work, which outlines the reality of the request for quotes or the RFQ.
This part is crucial.
When a specific state agency, which the document refers to as the customer needs a worker, they don't just call up their favorite vendor and offer them the job, right?
No, they are required to issue an RFQ through the state's business network system. And this introduces a profound level of artificial competition.
How does it work?
Well, the rules dictate that the customer agency can select at least one awarded contractor they want to invite to bid on their specific job opening. But then, the system automatically and randomly selects 25 other awarded contractors and forces them into the same RFQ event.
Okay, wait. I want to dwell on that mechanic for a second. 25 randomly selected competitors for every single job opening.
Every single one.
If a customer agency wants to hire one cybersecurity analyst and they invite the vendor they actually want to work with, the state's algorithm just drops 25 other vendors into the arena. It is a mandatory 26-way battle royale for every single placement.
It's intense, but it ensures that the state always receives highly competitive pricing, usually well below the vendor's established ceiling rate, because the vendor knows they are bidding against 25 unknown entities.
And even if you manage to win that 26-way lottery, the sheer burden placed on the vendor is immense. You are not functioning as a simple matchmaker who introduces a coder to a government manager and just collects a finder's fee.
Not at all. The contractor retains total responsibility for that staff member.
Meaning what, exactly?
The vendor handles all the payroll, all the tax withholdings, and all the mandatory background screenings. Furthermore, the vendor is entirely responsible for ensuring their staff stays current with industry advances.
Okay, that part blew my mind when I read it.
It's a huge hidden cost.
Yes. If a new commercial certification becomes standard in the market, the vendor has to pay for their staff to receive that training out of their own pocket. The state demands that the worker be kept up to date on commercial market advances, but explicitly refuses to pay for it.
The vendor absorbs that entire training cost. And of course, the place staff members receive absolutely zero state benefits. No state health insurance, no state pension.
And we also have to look at how the state caps the vendor's potential earnings, even when they do win the RFQ.
Right, the pricing rules.
Vendors establish maximum hourly ceiling rates. But the rules state that if a customer agency decides to use a project-based pricing model instead of an hourly one, meaning they pay a flat fee for the delivery of a finished product, the total cost of that project can never exceed the estimated cost to complete those same requirements under the hourly model.
Exactly. The state effectively prevents the vendor from ever earning a premium for efficiency.
It's wild. If a vendor figures out a way to finish a 6-month project in 3 months using a brilliant project-based team, the state still caps their payout at whatever the hourly estimate would have been.
The state has engineered a system where the financial upside for the vendor is strictly contained, but the competitive pressure and the administrative burden are maximized.
So, what does this all mean? If the system forces 25 randomly selected competitors into every single job opening, caps your project payouts based on hourly estimates, makes you pay for your workers' ongoing commercial training, and forces you to manage all the HR and background checks, how does any vendor actually build a reliable business model out of this? Why would a business subject itself to this?
Well, primarily because of the $430 million.
Right, the sheer volume of capital.
Exactly. The volume flowing through this system makes the friction worthwhile for those who figure out the formula. But more importantly, if you look at this from the state's perspective, this explains the true purpose of IT staff augmentation.
Which is?
The state is essentially outsourcing all of its volatility, all of its risk, and all of its HR headaches to the private sector.
Oh, that makes total sense.
The government doesn't have to worry about laying off employees when a massive tech project finishes.
Right.
They don't have to fund long-term pensions for short-term needs. They don't have to navigate complex state HR regulations to fire underperforming tech workers.
They just terminate the task order.
Exactly. They terminate the task order and the vendor absorbs the shock. The vendor literally serves as a human resources shock absorber for the government.
So the state pushes all the risk onto the vendor. But because the vendor is holding all that risk and operating within the state's highly sensitive digital infrastructure, the state demands absolute punishing compliance in return.
Absolutely punishing.
Which brings us to the financial consequences for slipping up. Here's where it gets really interesting.
This is where the bureaucratic machinery really shows its teeth.
The state mandates very specific reporting. If you are a vendor who has successfully navigated the pre-qualification gauntlet, won the RFQ lottery, and actually placed a worker, you are now required to file a quarterly sales report detailing your earnings.
Which sounds standard.
It does. But if you submit that report late, or if it is missing required information, the financial consequence is a fine of $250.
Now, in the context of a $430 million ecosystem, a $250 fine might sound like a slap on the wrist.
Except the text specifies it is $250 per calendar day.
Per calendar day, not business days.
Exactly. If the deadline is a Friday at 5:00 p.m. and your accountant forgets to hit send and they don't realize their mistake until they get back to the office on Monday morning, you are instantly down $750.
It adds up incredibly fast.
And it is not just the quarterly sales reports. There's also the My Florida Marketplace System, or MFMP.
Right, MFMP is the state's centralized e-procurement portal. It's the digital architecture where all these bids, invoices, and payments actually happen.
Okay.
And to fund the operation of this massive system, the state charges vendors a small transaction fee on the payments they receive.
And vendors must file a monthly MFMP transaction fee report to reconcile those fees if you submit that report late. The fine is $100 per calendar day.
Another daily fine.
It is an unrelenting daily bleed. It's like the ultimate bureaucratic swear jar. You forget to file a single piece of administrative paperwork, and the state just quietly drains your bank account by $350 every single time the sun goes down.
This raises an important question, though. It sounds incredibly harsh, especially since the document notes these penalties are assessed beginning with the very first full month or quarter of the contract.
Yeah, there's zero grace period.
None. But look at the underlying logic. The state is trusting these vendors with the keys to their most sensitive digital infrastructure.
Right.
They are trusting the vendor to thoroughly vet the criminal backgrounds of individuals who will have access to highly confidential citizen data, financial records, and security protocols.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Right. If a vendor proves they cannot accurately manage a basic Excel spreadsheet to file a quarterly sales report on time, how can the state possibly trust them to manage complex IT security requirements?
That is a fascinating perspective. To the state, administrative compliance is completely indistinguishable from technical competence.
Precisely. If your back office is sloppy, the state assumes your cybersecurity protocols are sloppy too. The financial penalties act as a filtration system.
They weed out the disorganized operators before those operators can introduce real vulnerabilities into the state's digital networks.
Exactly.
The $250 a day isn't just a fine to raise revenue, it is a structural integrity test for the vendors. It proves they have the operational maturity to handle government data.
Which is crucial.
Well, this has been a truly remarkable look under the hood of state procurement. We started by examining the overwhelming scale of this operation. Hundreds of millions of dollars spent annually to augment the government's workforce.
Yeah, the scale is just immense.
And we unpack the strategy of the supplemental bid, which allows the state to lock in low ceiling prices for existing roles while scouting the market for emerging tech talent.
We also analyze that prequalification gauntlet, right? Where a remarkably low financial barrier of $75,000 is intentionally paired with an incredibly stringent set of ethical and geopolitical requirements, which basically turns procurement into an extension of state policy.
And we looked at the daily reality for the vendors fighting through a randomized 26-way RFQ lottery, absorbing the massive human resources burden of background checks and out-of-pocket training, all while navigating strict project pricing caps.
Don't forget the swear jar.
Oh, I couldn't forget the swear jar, the unforgiving daily financial penalties that ensure only the most administratively rigorous companies even survive.
Exactly.
So if you are listening to this, the next time you interact with a state government app or a digital portal, you now know exactly what it took to put the person who coded that app in their chair. It is a massive, intricate web of transferred risk and strict regulation.
And, examining that web leaves me with a broader question, something implied by the sheer scale of these documents.
What's that?
If a state agency is relying this heavily on an outsourced, temporary workforce to build and maintain its critical digital infrastructure, what happens to the institutional memory of the government?
That's a great point.
When a massive, multi-year tech initiative is finally completed, the contract ends, and those temporary staff members just pack up and go work in the private sector. Does the deep, fundamental knowledge of how that government system actually works leave with them?
Wow. It brings us right back to our Broadway theater at the beginning. The state owns the stage, and the show looks incredible. But if the entire technical crew leaves after the final curtain, who actually knows how to turn the lights back on tomorrow?
Exactly.
It is a fascinating dynamic to ponder. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the high-stakes machinery of government procurement. We'll see you next time.